One thing which I've always found interesting about YouTube as a platform is how much it allows people to indulge their most out there hobbies and perspectives. You can watch an in-depth video about English voice acting in the anime industry, or this conspiracy theory video about Super Mario's hair, or this 20-hour long ASMR video, all of which would only really appeal to specific online communities with interests that are really quite niche. Video makers have realised that they don't need to appeal to everyone in order to be successful on this platform, but rather to make sure that they catch the attention of the small, specific group of people who will consistently buy into a particular type of content. This goes some way to explaining why reactionary political channels have found such a massive following in the latter half of YouTube's existence. Channels which rally against feminism, progressivism, and multiculturalism are of significant interest because these edgy takes are rarely given validation in the mainstream media. In recent years, we've seen champions of these channels like Milo Yiannopoulos, Sargon of Akkad, and Candace Owens being written about in broadsheet newspapers, featured on cable television networks, and even embraced by populist right-wing political parties. In 2016, if you'd been at all interested in these channels, chances are you would have come across thumbnails of a certain man looking slightly overdressed and out of place in this very lo-fi area of YouTube. I am, of course, talking about Dave Rubin, who runs the interview show, The Rubin Report. In 2016 and onwards, whenever something happened in the news cycle involving overreaching political correctness, you could bet your ass Dave was going to show up a week or so later on YouTube interviewing whoever was involved. When Jordan Peterson gained notoriety after refusing to use gender pronouns, Dave was in there fast as lightning to get his side of the story and present him to his audience as a modern day hero. Here's Brett Weinstein, who you might not know. He got swept up in allegations of racism at Evergreen State College for refusing to participate in a day of absence. And logically, sitting opposite him, there's Dave telling him that everything's going to be okay. When James Demure was fired from Google for writing a memo criticizing their diversity hires, you better believe that our boy Dave was all over that. He's all about that free speech.
I saw your name, I saw the story, and I was like, man, this is the type of guy that I gotta talk to. I should be all about this story.
Dave became all but unavoidable on YouTube because by associating himself with everyone involved in these news stories and fighting their corner, he was able to bump himself up to the top of the anti-PC algorithms, which was a great place to be for big viewing figures at the time. For those yet to be initiated in the free marketplace of ideas, I would thoroughly recommend watching this video as a starting point, which discusses the evolution of the Rubin Report in detail from the very first episode to this year in a way which is very interesting, informative, engaging, etc. I'm going to be giving a paraphrase version here to catch everyone up.
Hold on, guys.
Rubin's show is broadly about free speech, the value of new ideas, and the importance of independent thought. And by and large, in the early days of the show, Dave seemed to make efforts to cover these topics from a somewhat independent perspective, bringing guests from both the left and right sides of the political aisle. Dave positioned himself as a liberal who was disenfranchised, but still very much a member of the left, committed to their ideals, but dissatisfied with their methods. In the Rubin Report's early episodes, liberals could indulge the part of themselves which had become dissatisfied with hyper-sensationalized left-wing discourse. A lot of people were glad to see someone challenging the status quo, even if this meant watching a lot of criticism being levelled at their own political side. But eventually, somewhat inevitably, other viewers began to latch onto the show who had never been left-leaning in the first place. Whilst for liberal viewers the experience of watching the Rubin Report could be seen as an exercise in humility to accept and try to fix the faults with their side, for viewers with tendencies towards the reactionary right, this uncomfortable obligation of self-reflection didn't really exist. They were simply watching a show where someone from the left confirmed to them that every bad thing which they believed about the left was true, leaving them free to simply sit back and enjoy having their own perspectives reinforced. Over time, the shift in the show's audience led to a shift in the focus of the messaging, with Dave often tailoring his messages to align with things that his anti-PC crowd liked to hear, particularly regarding Trump, who was widely seen as the anti-PC candidate. As an example, take a look at this direct message from March 2016 in the run-up to the presidential election, wherein, after roundly praising Donald Trump for almost the entirety of the segment, Dave makes a mild criticism of him.
What does electing Trump actually mean? If he wins, does anyone think he'll actually adhere to the Constitution? Will he care about due process or respect the 3 branches of government? Will he sue reporters who investigate the White House? Will we get into a war over a mistaken retweet? We have no idea what the country will look like after we elect someone who cares more about his own rules than the law of the land.
The next week, after receiving feedback from his viewers, Dave then felt the need to retract his one tiny criticism, emphasizing now that Donald Trump was actually no less trustworthy than any other political candidate.
As some of you pointed out, the notion of not knowing how someone will act once in office is actually no different than with most politicians. They pretty much all will say anything to get elected and then do whatever they can to stay in power. The average person sees usurping of power and Washington gridlock. In their minds, is a regular politician going to get our country out of that pattern? No, but an over-the-top businessman might. While we can parse out why Trump has risen, the fact is he is here, and all of us have to acknowledge there is a political movement brewing on the horizon.
When Donald Trump eventually went on to win the election in 2016, Dave declared it as a victory for his show's viewers, the people who had been open to hearing new ideas.
This was a win for us, right? Because if you think about it, the elite, the media, everybody, the establishment all wanted one thing to happen. And what happened? The people actually used their voting power to stop that very thing from happening. That's actually beautiful.
Now, trying to pin down Dave's own personal beliefs is difficult, and in a sense, I don't think there's that much value in doing so, as they can quite quickly change depending on the situation. For example, Dave constantly emphasizes that we need to stop labeling everyone as bigots and racist for having different political opinions to us, but he also often points out that the political ideas of the left are inherently racist, and that the far left are bigots. And he also says things like that he doesn't buy into silly boycotts, but then on a separate occasion he'll advise that everyone should boycott Ben & Jerry's for having a far-left political agenda. So this video isn't going to be about Dave's own personal ideas and political beliefs, even though I know there's a lot there to talk about and dig into. We have much more important work to do here discussing Dave's show. I'm planning for this to be a 3-part series, and in this first video, we're going to be looking specifically at the themes the show tackles and Dave's general techniques as an interviewer. But a running theme which I want to be constantly shining a spotlight on throughout this whole thing is exploring how well the Rubin Report does in achieving its main goal of fostering open and honest conversations about ideas. Up until September 2016, when the libertarian think tank Learn Liberty got involved, the Rubin Report's viewers were the sole financiers of the show via Patreon, and they were very enthusiastic consumers of the product which Rubin was selling, a show which doesn't shy away from difficult topics and provides honest perspectives which are completely absent from the mainstream media, all in the name of free speech. However, as good as that might sound on paper, premising a show entirely on free speech as this amorphous, non-partisan concept is not an easy sell, because it factors into so many situations which are perceived very differently by the left and the right. Being a pure out-and-out defender of free speech would mean supporting Ann Coulter giving her talks on college campuses, but then also equally supporting the rights of students to protest against her. Christopher Wiley testifying against Cambridge Analytica, Jordan Peterson refusing to use gender pronouns, Chelsea Manning being given a fellowship by Harvard in spite of her criminal conviction, Edward Snowden whistleblowing on the NSA, football players kneeling during the national anthem, people displaying the Confederate flag, people burning the American flag. I would argue that finding an audience who enjoys seeing an uncompromising and unflinching defense of all these things would be a terrible business model for a YouTube channel, because as humans we're only really inclined to rally behind specific cultural issues wherein the people using their free speech are expressing viewpoints which we already inherently agree with. Like it or not, we're all prone to disagree with certain freedoms of expression from time to time. Through this lens, Rubin's audience would often see themselves being cast into the role of the antagonists, exactly as prone to hysteria and averse to free speech as their political rivals in certain situations. As the Rubin Report found its feet and found its target audience, it ended up engineering a solution to this problem by focusing its energies on freedoms of expression that the political right had far more affinity with, such as the right to criticize social justice movements, the right to speak about race realism, the right to speak out against immigration, and the right to criticize multiculturalism. Thus, the complex and multifaceted issue of free speech could be simplified, so that Rubin's viewers hardly ever found themselves being confronted with issues which would put them on the wrong side of the debate. The show's core proposition was that viewers who enjoyed hearing the opinions expressed by the guests were by that very fact defenders of free speech, and Dave made frequent appeals to the virtuous qualities of the show's viewers, painting them as the last bastion of intellectualism, tolerance, and open-mindedness in an increasingly closed-minded society.
You know, there's so much intolerance of the other on both sides, and I think we can create something that's so much better than that. Actually, I don't just think it, I know it, because I see it already happening. We absolutely hit our stride by calling out regressive bullshit, and by addressing the regressives, the tide is actually turning. There's this new group of people that are lining up and are willing to at least have these discussions and not, you know, cast aspersions on everyone we disagree with and all that. Now there's this group of people online that I think we're a part of that have helped refine some ideas. We'll have this good faith group that's going to be doing. It's going to be a small group, but intellectually powerful and rigorous. The mainstream media continues to spoon feed the masses soundbite clickbait. We're here doing some real proof of concept work to prove that you guys are a lot smarter than they think. There was something beyond just the laughs that I could feel on the stage. The room felt lit with intellect and curiosity. My brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas. The conversations we're having here are finally starting to leak out into the rest of the world.
I would say that this approach of making viewers feel valued, smart, and important was key to the Rubin Report's success. Other long-form interview programs typically don't present themselves as having any grander purpose than being light, informative entertainment for their audiences, and they also typically offer a much wider variety of topics for discussion. As an example, take a look at the interviews of Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, Mark Maron, Terry Gross, Jesse Thorne, and most of the other people who exist in this eclectic online interview broadcast sphere. The topics range from literature to science to comedy to general well-being. No interview is the same, and all the guests have insights into extremely different things. However, with the topics of conversation being so wide-ranging each and every week, it's a difficult task for these interviewers to build up a consistent following who will tune in every time. The Rubin Report doesn't have this problem, as it focuses so intently on a small handful of topics and perspectives and allows these to inform its selection of the guests. This means that it can draw the same audience every week who know that they will hear about things which they're already invested in from perspectives which they're likely to agree with. In some ways, the guests who Rubin invites onto his show are incredibly diverse. There are people from the political right, people from the progressive left, people who used to be part of the Muslim community, people of colour, feminists, gay people, trans people, a truly rich tapestry of diverse backgrounds and unique life experiences. However, in spite of this, from week to week, the views expressed by the guests all have a very similar focus.
They just start shaking. They're, ah! The left, they don't know how to handle it.
The standard left
progressive vision is not rich enough to actually function.
Is cultural relativism as deployed by those who call themselves left-wing and weaponized.
I realized that liberals were actually the racists, that liberals were actually the trolls.
Things have gotten a little out of control in the feminist sphere. It's super pro-censorship.
Identity politics and the impugning of motives and outrage has supplanted rational argument.
I was just sick of being co-opted. I was sick of SJWs having this monopoly on anything trans.
A resentment of people from the progressive left, which the show often describes as social justice warriors, seems to permeate through nearly every discussion, and there are certain talking points which the show is particularly fond of. These are
that so-called tolerant left. They're supposed to be tolerant enough to have a discussion, and they don't even understand how to have a discussion.
If you want us to be able to have discussions like this, not just on your show, but on the national news and in the pages of the newspapers, if you believe in that, you cannot vote Democrat.
The feminists that I've been seeing are unwilling to have an intellectual discussion just based on the statistics and facts that don't fit within their belief system.
I'm at the top of the progressive stack. They don't want to hear me speak.
Left is forgetting how to argue even amongst themselves.
The goal is to silence. No other opinions should be heard.
Part of the radical dialectic of the PC authoritarian left.
The toxic ideology of leftism, which rates victimhood as virtue and will swallow anyone who dares deviate from its authoritarian rule. We can no longer give these hysterical people an inch because they won't stop taking until we've all silenced ourselves. The backwards thinking of cultural Marxism is coming for all dissenters. This regressive movement will come for all of us one day. I suspect that it's coming for private citizens for Wrong Think Next. Make no mistake, there is a thinkwisition going on here, and it can come for anyone at any time.
They're being coddled, they're being protected by professors at these major universities.
And it's where all of the indoctrination takes place. And then, of course, the students who are indoctrinated go out into all the major spheres of our society.
We teach them how to be political activists and infiltrating agents. And I'm not making this up.
It's also fighting the culture war, which is for free speech, for diversity of ideas, and really against what these college campuses have created.
They're going to the administrators and saying, you're all microaggressing us and we need trigger warnings and it's white privilege. And
an environment where these anarchists are doing the bidding of this coalition is so dangerous.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a nascent socialist revolution brewing on our universities.
Turning places of higher learning into places where people are just getting high on intersectionality. The social justice warrior ideology that has ransacked clear thinking on the college campus in America. Once the home for free speech in America, and it is now a cesspool of left-wing, see I can do it too, hate.
This movement called Black Lives Matter. I think we talked about that a little bit. Mm-hmm. It's as bogus and as phony a movement as the notion that O.J. Simpson is innocent from having killed 2 people.
I absolutely hate Black Lives Matter Toronto.
Black Lives Matter is here and it doesn't even make any sense.
I'm not celebrating Independence Day because, this country doesn't represent my people's, 50% of him, he means, right?
Yeah.
My people's struggle.
It is a very angry, bitter, profane, lesbianic sort of feminism.
It didn't correct the excesses of second wave feminism. It took those excesses and made them even more extreme.
They go, well, we're out in the streets doing stuff, and it's like, yeah, but the people who used to do that actually had problems.
We have to expose the fact that they are after a utopia, this whole justice thing.
They've always been fed this grievance narrative.
when young people are always looking for a reason to fight. I mean, we want to change the world. That's our thing, changing the world. Well, when the world's pretty good, what do you change?
I don't see any reason to import these cultures into liberal Western democracies.
We're importing people from bad cultures, and I mean, that's the heart of regressivism.
They come here, they don't mix, it's not multicultural.
The unprecedented movement of people into the continent at the same time that this sort of breakdown of what we are ourselves is going on.
There is going to be a flood in the next coming years of tens of millions of Muslims.
Yeah? Come into Europe, come into our continent.
And they're just having so many kids and like growing and taking over these entire communities.
An EU official's daughter was murdered by a migrant the other day. And it's just, okay, well now you know how everyone else is feeling.
There is an insatiable thirst for these types of perspectives amongst the Rubin Report audience, and Dave is keen to offer them up for consumption as often as he possibly can. That's why we see repeat appearances of guests who hit that sweet spot, like Sargon 3 times, Ben Shapiro like 5 times, and then there's Jordan Peterson 5 times. 6 times. 7. There were 7 times. 7 times in 2 years. Guests who leverage the key talking points of the show are brought back time and time again, because these are the people that Dave can rely on to offer up those talking points that his audience enjoy listening to the most. Now, obviously there are examples who don't fit this mold, such as Bishop Barron and Yanis Varoufakis, but they are outliers, and with Yanis in particular, Dave starts to look very out of his depth when the conversation veers away from his usual territory into a more substantive discussion of analytical frameworks and economics.
That's from Marx. Schumpeter got it all from Marx anyway. You read Schumpeter, who is a doyen of the right, he himself admits that even though his politics were right-wing, his economic theory would not exist.
If viewing figures are to be believed, this interview was similarly lost on Dave's audience, with only 70,000 of them tuning in to watch a PhD economist discussing the utility of Marxism, versus the 750,000 of them who tuned in to watch Sargon of Akkad exposing a supposed socialist uprising taking place in our universities. The talking point driven approach to interviewing works really well with guests like Sargon. However, in the instances where Rubin is speaking to guests who have a lot more to offer than hot takes in the culture war against the left, it does them a massive disservice to constrain the conversation to such a limited field of interest. When Eric Weinstein from the investment firm TL Capital first appeared on the Rubin Report in January 2017, he immediately stood out as one of the more interesting people who the show had ever invited on. He had genuinely perceptive insights about the way mathematical minds work, about financial models and US businesses adapting themselves, about the importance of critical thinking and dealing with media narratives with a healthy skepticism. Eric is a stellar example of what happens when Dave features a guest who exists outside of the purely SJW bashing sphere. They immediately elevate the level of discourse on the show, from relentless trashing of radical left-wing behaviours to quite interesting discussion, and I personally don't see how anyone could watch this and not be taken by how thoughtfully Eric articulated his views. Dave Rubin personally received a lot of praise for his interview in the comments, and I can see why people might think that this insightful exchange was testament to Dave doing at least something right with his interviewing technique. Dave being a good interviewer is the main defense which a lot of people make when Dave's ideas or actions come under fire, that sure, he's not an intellectual heavyweight, but that doesn't matter because the main thing he does is interviewing, and that, my friend, is something which he is extremely good at. Let's have a look at the questions he asked Eric Weinstein in the opening 30 minutes of the interview and see how well they work on their own as prompts to stimulate the kinds of open and meaningful conversations that Dave wants the show to be all about.
What do you have in your brain that the non-math person doesn't have? Is it tough to sort of view the world through the mathematical prism when we live in a time when that seemingly is so not rewarded, when sort of having facts and knowledge and evidence is not rewarded and your brain operates in that space? So do you weep for the state of math in America right now, just the public state of it? Is there any part of your brain that doesn't operate in that way?
Oh yeah.
Which part?
Putting aside the fact that Dave sounds like he's playing a game of 20 questions to work out what the word math means, when you evaluate how well these questions work alone as prompts to stimulate open dialogue, you start to see that Dave's interviewing technique runs counter to a lot of universally acknowledged best practices. The first very, very small thing I want to point out is Dave's tendency to ask closed questions. Many that he puts to his guests could be answered with a simple yes or no response. This is generally considered to be bad technique because it gives the guest very little chance to take the reins of the conversation and take it to other interesting places. However, this is an extremely minor quibble. What I see as being a much bigger problem is the way that Rubin's questions constantly seem to project some of his own ideas onto the guest's response before they've even said anything. Take, for example, this question.
Is it tough to sort of view the world through the mathematical prism when we live in a time when that seemingly is so not rewarded, when sort of having facts and knowledge and evidence is not rewarded and your brain operates in that space?
Here, Rubin is asking a question about whether it's tough for people like Eric who approach things in a logical way, but he's also putting forward an implicit assumption that using facts and knowledge and evidence is something which is not rewarded in our society. Now, his interviewee is someone who works in venture capital, an industry where having an aptitude for rigorously analysing business models and identifying those which are poised for substantial growth in the markets, i.e. having facts, knowledge and evidence, are things which are really, really well rewarded. Eric's propensity for these things is probably what enabled him to become a managing director, so the way Rubin frames the question seems quite odd. Dave's questions are strangely framed because he's appealing to the emotions of his audience rather than trying to get the best conversation out of the guest. The narrative that Dave's audience is a small community of rational thinkers fighting the larger oppressive forces of the hysterical left is projected onto most discussions that take place on the show, and as we see here, it often occurs in places where it makes no logical sense. Throughout these early questions, even though Rubin is trying hard to play the role of a neutral interviewer, the wording of his questions consistently conveys the same narrative of reasonable, analytical people being a minority group who are under attack.
You think people don't do that well? I feel like maybe the choice is the hard part. So people just go to one or the other. So you have a certain amount of people that are just purely driven by the emotion part, and we see a lot of that these days. Or you see a certain amount of people purely driven by the analytical part. I think you see less of them, although obviously plenty of them exist. But that choice is one of the key things there is in life, right? And for those people, it does make it a little harder to act in the public space, right? Because there's a cavalcade of craziness that they're going to have to deal with.
Many of Dave's questions simply amount to him expressing an opinion and then checking to see if the guest agrees with him.
They want there to be men to find. And it's become like a running joke for me, like, I don't know where they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah.
They're literally word police now.
Yeah, so the word police are strong.
What do you make of the feeling that he was going for? I think that's a pretty legit feeling on what's happened with the left related to free speech and the endless hysteria and everyone's a bigot and a racist and identity politics. All of that feeling, I think, is legit. Do you see that as a legit feeling?
Dave often wedges his perspectives on things into interviews in a way which doesn't really enhance the conversation, but rather relegates the importance of the guest down to a secondary position behind the key talking points that Dave thinks his viewers want to hear. A particularly odd example of this is when Dave interviewed Cassie Jaye, a filmmaker who had recently done a documentary called The Red Pill, which took a very sympathetic view of men's rights activism. In the same year, a new Ghostbusters film had been released featuring an all-female cast, something which had enraged many rational, clear thinkers on the internet, including many members of Dave's audience. So, naturally, Dave wanted to bring this up.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what you thought of Ghostbusters. That would really be if we get through this whole thing and don't talk about Ghostbusters. Did you see it, number one?
Oh, you're all gonna hate me. No, I didn't.
You didn't see it?
I didn't.
I didn't see it either. I was gonna watch it on Apple TV the other night, and then I just couldn't. But what did you think?
Okay, so neither Dave nor the guest have even seen this movie. An interesting start to the discussion. Dave spends quite a long time here just describing the trailer release and how it didn't look like a good film. All that Cassie can then really do is regurgitate what Dave said straight back to him, that yes, the media loves feminism, and yes, it looked like a bad film.
Well, and I wonder how much the media was playing up that if people are against this film, it's because they hate women or they're misogynist or whatever, and that actually helped, get feminists to support the film just to, in spite of any haters. So yeah, the film didn't look good from what I saw of the trailer. And I do think it blew up more because of the controversy around the film, and it wasn't a good idea to begin with. I mean, it's like iconic film, why do something like that? But
do you think it's weird that they say, all right,
this is obviously a bad path to continue on, as Cassie visibly has no personal insights to add to Dave's on this highly trivial and arguably meaningless subject. But Dave carries on regardless, opining about this film, which looks to me like it was made for kids.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they can. I don't know if they're going to be successful.
Yeah.
I don't know what to
is that the funny thing though?
Dave leads his guest into a completely dead end and makes her look a bit stupid because she has nothing to contribute to this conversation about a Ghostbusters trailer, which is stupid in itself. This leads me on to another strange aspect of Dave's interviewing technique. He asks a lot of rambling questions that don't really seem to go anywhere. While I play this clip from the Eric Weinstein interview, I want you to close your eyes and pretend that Dave is talking to you, and just try and understand what question he is actually asking you.
You think this need to know everything all the time is sort of a new need? It seems like it's been ramped up in the last couple of years, where there's just so many people. And maybe this is just a function of that we're all connected now and constantly on our phones and all that, but just where there's so many people who are constantly, the way religion used to constantly preach that it had the truth, I feel like now it's either politicians or demagogues or just online personalities, just whatever, that just constantly will tell you they know what's going on, really. And it's like, no, you don't. Nobody knows.
It's really, really hard to work out what Dave is asking here. I actually wrote this whole thing out just to see if I could actually find a question somewhere in here. And, it's just a random collection of sentences, really. It starts with a little question, and then Dave goes on to lamenting our reliance on technology, like an old man would, and then kind of randomly mixes up his talking points to move on to religion, and then he just tails off whilst talking to himself. It's a huge win in the marketplace of avant-garde free-form questions. Let's see how Eric responds.
And it's like, no, you don't. Nobody knows.
Well, this is the whole essence of, do you believe that life is about answers or about struggles?
This right here is exactly why Dave's fans in the comments think that he's a good interviewer. Because certain guests like Eric will give considered philosophical answers to anything. Dave can throw whatever garbage he wants their way and they will still say something enlightened. And this isn't a one-off. This is one of Dave's signature moves. He starts off as if he's going to ask a question, but then kind of blunders on through some random thoughts of his own, and by the time he's finished, it's really hard to work out what his actual question was in the first place. Here's an example from an interview with Tommy Sotomayor.
How much of this is just compounded by white liberal guilt, do you think? Because this is something I talk about, that liberals have gone crazy. I would argue it's really progressives and the left, not what true liberals are. But that liberal guilt in general just enables this stuff. That because we're so afraid to talk about anything because it will come off as racist or bigoted or any of that stuff, that we just perpetuate this cycle.
I have
well-meaning people. You know what I mean? I don't think they're bad people. That's the most important part. I don't think, for the most part, there are people, of course, who have bad intentions. But I think for the most part, they don't, and they're doing something bad.
And that's the end of Dave's question. Here's another one from his interview with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, where Dave wants to ask her about her appearance on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. But first, he wants to say all of his own opinions about it.
And I wanted to discuss one thing with you, because I saw you, it was probably about 6 months ago now, on The Daily Show when Jon Stewart was still there. And I interned at The Daily Show in 1999. Jon is, we've met a couple of times and he's given me some great advice about comedy and life. And I love Jon, just like everyone else loves Jon. That said, I thought his interview with you was really terrible. I thought every time you brought up something about Islam, again, coming from the history that you come from, coming from your life, your firsthand experience, every time you said something, he immediately brought it back to Christianity. He immediately said, well, Christianity did this stuff, and you're focusing on Islam. And it really was that regressive thing that we started this conversation about. So A, do you agree that it was a sort of messy interview? And B, were you shocked? Because I would think, everything being equal, that you would sit down with this guy and he would absolutely love you. You stand for every liberal value and women's rights and equality and all that. And I thought it was really terrible.
In my mind, this flies in the face of everything a good interviewer would do. It's prioritizing Dave's perspective above that of the guest. And for an interviewer who is all about hearing what other people think,
I'm genuinely curious to learn from people of all walks of life. I actually genuinely like listening to people, and I like seeing the gears work and how do they think.
Dave's habit of stuffing his own opinions or things that he thinks his audience wants to hear into every question is completely irreconcilable with his aim of stimulating open dialogue with the guests. Let's return once more to our pal Eric Weinstein. As you can probably tell, I'm quite fond of Eric, in spite of him starting what is perhaps the lamest boy band ever. The reason I like him is because of an interview which he did with a man who is famously not Dave Rubin, Tim Ferriss. Just have a listen to the questions that Tim asks in the first 30 minutes of his interview. I think it gives you a really good idea of how a good interviewer can explore eclectic and intellectual topics through the specific lens of the guest's own personal life experiences.
What is the first example that comes to mind of a time when you had that fear of swimming away from the consensus and facing the scrutiny or criticism of people in a given community? One thing I noticed at your home was that you have a lot of musical instruments. When did you start experimenting with music? Is that because humans have potentially some type of innate grammar that they are for music, in the same way they might have some type of innate language grammar, like along the lines of a Chomsky in his theories, or is it something else? You've also dug into natural human languages.
Yeah.
What languages have you
in the past
given a go? What does, if anything, studying music have in common with studying natural languages? Because the latter is where I'm more comfortable. I remember going to your office and seeing all sorts of toys of various types, and then a figurine of Kung Fu Panda. What is your relationship to Kung Fu Panda?
Listening to this interview was absolutely fascinating. Eric talked to Tim about his passion for languages, the way they logically fit together and why he enjoys them, his love of music. A highlight for me was when Tim asked Eric the question about when he first went against the consensus, and Eric's answer was that he learned to play classical guitar wrong, using his little finger for all the parts that his thumb should have done, and described how a whole guitar shop gathered around him in confusion and awe because he looked so strange to them playing this way. However, the clip I'm going to play here is Eric's answer to the Kung Fu Panda question. Sit back and enjoy the hottest take of the Kung Fu Panda film that you're ever going to hear.
This is emotional, embarrassing, and rather weighty. But I went reluctantly. I can't say that I relished going to a children's film, even though I had two kids who were excited to see it. But my wife said it would be a good idea. And as I sat there in the theater, I got deeper and deeper into the story. And when the film was finally over, I found myself weeping. And
were your kids okay with that?
I don't think anybody was okay with that. It was a little weird. And what I realized was that it was the only film that I'd ever seen that struggled with the issue that I felt almost defines my quest, which is, why can't a self-teacher leave pupils? And if you think about that for a second, you realize that Einstein wasn't successful in leaving any Einsteins. And Francis Crick didn't leave Francis Cricks, and Winston Churchill didn't leave any Winston Churchills. If there was some way for a Newton to leave a Newton, dependably, the world would be a completely different place. And what Kung Fu Panda was trying to do, in my opinion, was to struggle with this question of how would an innovator leave a successor when it's his time to go.
I loved this explanation of the Kung Fu Panda film. It's one which is thought-provoking, philosophical, but most of all, deeply relatable and human. Hearing a smart person shine a light on these things, which are so quirky and niche in themselves, but at the same time, so universally relatable and revealing, is what I would consider the main value of long-form interviews to be. And it's this key value which is always jarringly absent from interviews on the Rubin Report. Dave's very narrow focus on talking points renders him incapable of teasing out these fascinating personal anecdotes because, quite simply, there's nowhere to slot them in his self-manufactured culture war Rubik's Cube. It's worth mentioning that in the Tim Ferriss interview, Eric still spoke about topics that Dave loves, such as the importance of free speech and his concerns about censorship of people we disagree with, but this lasted all of 5 minutes in a 1.5 hour long interview. Eric got to bring up those perspectives on his own terms through questions which didn't directly seek them out, but rather looked to uncover first who he was as a person. It's with the benefit of knowing the meaningful discussion that a competent and intellectual interviewer can get out of Eric Weinstein that Dave's flaws are drawn into sharp focus. Interesting guests like Eric, who have far more strings to their bow than simply affirming how they are smart and the left is dumb, aren't really given the room to do so on the Rubin Report because Dave's questions are so endlessly focused around the culture war bubble and trying to find a neat angle which will reinforce his audience's perspectives on things. This has the effect of tethering the guest to a narrow script of talking points, depriving them of the chance to take the lead and bring in topics which might give the audience more insight into who they are as people. I would say that this makes Dave very inept as an interviewer. These small flaws in his interviewing technique all add up. The closed questions, the leading premises, the insane rambling. It all adds up to an interview show which offers very little for intellectually curious viewers, because even when the guest is a good one, Dave's interviewing style doesn't allow them to shine their brightest. How Dave expects to be able to stimulate open discussion and the free exchange of ideas using these methods is beyond me. However, these flaws usually go unnoticed because his critics are often focusing on other things which they perceive to be a much bigger problem. I'll be delving further into these in my next video. If you made it through to the end, thanks for watching everyone. Until next time, I'll see you back here on the battlefield of ideas once I've got my shit together to make the next video.
First I go on tour, then I fuck my bitch, she tryna read between the lines, I'm just tryna read her lips. Yeah, I fuck her before I dip, hit Vegas, hit the strip, young niggas stacking chips, bring it back, bring it back.
Yeah, first I take a trip, kill the shit, now I'm popping zills, hit my nigga slim for the shit, now I'm off the shit, now I'm at a crib, real cat, now she taking now, fat and easy, we burn Timbah.On.Toast.